I give Saatvik 10 seconds. He's switching devices. He should be here in no time.
I'm assuming I'm visible and audible both.
Yep, you are.
Cool. I'll start in my first word. Post-conflict states have been through a lot. They've seen their families die. They've seen the government collapse. They've seen all semblance of what state looks like, all semblance of trust that they would have in a system, all of it crumble apart. These people are wounded not only physically but also emotionally, and they don't have systems to support themselves. Which is to say that people within these states, the governments, and everybody are largely reliant on the people and their coordination and their collaboration to set things up from the scratch. This looks like public healthcare system. This looks like welfare system. This looks like employment systems. This looks like making a constitution and things like this, right? Why is this important? Because notice when you have different ethnicities, this look like difference in terms of what sort of culture these ethnicities follow. It looks like difference in terms of what religion they have, and it also looks like what kind of practices that they have. And the crucial note that these people have been intolerant of each other in the past, which means that these people are less likely to be, say, less understanding of having one leader then, right? Because notice, how do we divide the state lines is largely going to be these smaller states within the larger country are going to be, say, areas that have been governed by these places ancestrally. So some part, if it has Gujarati people living there, the Gujarati community governs them. If some part has maybe the Marwadi community living there, these communities go ahead and stay there at that point in time, right? But notice, why is this important and what is the aim of this case then? The problem we are trying to solve is twofold. Firstly, is the idea of how you have everybody in the same state. What are the reasons for why we want this to happen? I think the first is to say that you have resource sharing, because notice, if you don't share your resources and things like this, it becomes particularly hard then, because notice you have, say, geographical resources. These look like mines, these look like plains, these look like probably other sorts of things like access to ports, the sea, or things like this, right? These are very geography specific, and having access to maybe a mine, maybe a port within your own country massively helps. So geographical benefits are massive here. But the second is just in terms of workforce, right? You need to build the nation from the ground up. So you particularly go ahead and need workforce, more population to go ahead and help your country to go ahead and be better in that sense. But I think the second idea is that this is the only mechanism that then goes ahead and guarantees a future for these people at a point in time where the comparative would then look like these countries or these ethnicities not being trustful of each other, not liking each other, and wanting to have their own state, which literally happens in so many places. You literally have so many countries splitting into north and south and things like this. This is literally because the ethnicities are not comfortable with being governed by one person who has more power, things like this, right? Why is this continued existence more important? Because if secession happens, this literally leads to more war, and these people don't want war. The problem that then happens, and what we're going to solve is simple, right? How do you go ahead and model this debate then? I think it's a 5-point model. The first is that we give these people the right to education and cultural languages within their own settlements. The second is the idea that we allow them to practice their own religions and cultural affairs. The third is special provisions for their ethnicity and their local, say, practices within the national legal system. The fourth is community level governance, and the fifth is ethnic quotas in public service. Before I have go forward, yeah, what is your clarifications here?
Yeah, what does the central government comprise of? How does it look
Yeah,
like?
I'm getting there. I'm getting there. But chill, right? Then notice the central government would then comprise of people who are the representatives of these very communities. So we're assuming that this is maybe, say, 5 communities, 7 communities, big and major ethnicities. Notice that this is also the model on which countries in this current status quo operate. You look at the idea, for example, take the United Arab Emirates. There are 7 emirates, and all the 7 emirates have one leader who is basically the ruler and has been the historical family that rules that area. And these 7 emirates form the national body of the larger nation at large, right? This then, like say, the president is the Prince of Abu Dhabi, and the Prime Minister is the Prince of Dubai, and things like this. So these communities can come together and decide what structure you want to have in the at an international level. But why this is important is that this gives all communities and all ethnicities a representation and stake at the table. Why is that particularly important? Why do people then need this in general, right? Notice People know that they want to be united. People know that being in a state is good because this debate is a THS. It's happening in status quo, which means that you have the historical precedent of so many countries, and knowing that if you are not within a state, you're literally fucked. If you're landlocked, any state that wants to be separate from the larger three other ethnicities and becomes a landlocked state is going to be significantly worse off and needs a lot more things, right? They need to get labor, they need to cross borders for trade and things like this, which is why you want to go ahead and be collected within a state at all points in time. Notice why this is not particularly happening, and this is the mechanism that goes ahead and solves this, right? Because notice, people mistrust the other community. They see one person from one community and they feel that this person does not understand what my religion is, this person does not understand the significance of my culture, and because this is my own cultural land, I am not comfortable with this person going ahead and governing over me at all points in time. Why does this change? Because when you have localized autonomy, when you have your state, your ethnicity being important or being given a more important status, you have people at least trusting the system. You feel that, okay, if my leader is going to a national stage and doing something, at least I know that people are not strong arming this person, because this person has the ability to go ahead and govern and make changes within this own area, which means that they see somebody from their community represent their culture and show, bring it out and cover its nuances, so people aren't left behind. But secondly, this allows you to build trust over time, because notice, the debate or the point in this debate is to avoid a sort of secession, is to avoid more conflict, which means that this needs to happen quickly. Because notice what kind of rhetoric exists, right? Rhetoric is like, oh, this person, how will they tell you what to live? We are the people who live in this land, we know our forms of life, we other people can't comprehend this, and things like this. But before that, yeah, Khokher, ask.
This is clearly a post-conflict state. What do you think so is the demographic of the state? Are people living together or people separate?
No, people are separated within their own areas, and people don't like this because that means that they are going ahead and facing a lot of problems because of this, right? Because notice, unity is a good thing, which is why we have unity in so many places. Collaboration is literally the base on which nations are built. These people don't trust the other person, but the point is, at a point in time where they come together, because notice, the comparative can't be just anything different, right? You are trying to form a state, you are trying to go ahead and get out of a conflict and get sort of global legitimacy for this. I think when you're a larger state, this also means that people are more likely to recognize you at a point in time where small groups are not fragmenting and asking for their own place. But largely, you go ahead and give concessions over time. So if you want to integrate and unite as a state, unite as a larger country, I think this is going to happen over time. But the point is that you need to play this debate on two fronts. The first is to say that you need to be sure that the situation you are in is stable, is safe, and you are not going ahead and backsliding or not going to have a civil war. But at the same time, this needs to be forward looking in a way where people become trusting of each other. I think a collaborative system which does not undermine the legitimacy or undermine the importance of any one cultural identity is the best way to do this, because the people trust the system, the people trust the government, and that is why you should propose.
I thank the speaker for that very fine speech. With that, calling upon the LO.
Yeah, I'll just want to confirm if I'm audible.
Yep, you are.
Okay. Governments defends post-conflict states where provinces are not divided for administration purposes, but rather on ethnic lines. The coastal areas with ports and ships would be given to the Turks, while the barren lands where you can't even do agriculture and farming is given to the Kurds, implying a constant sense of jealousy for resources, which like strengthens and which fuels the in existing communal divides and communalism, where people like communities start fearing and start being jealous of other communities for the resource richness that their geographical provinces has. That is the comparative that Gov is defending. I want to be very clear on what our comparative is on OP. Notice that we are often post-conflict states have had conflicts and which can be like colonialism or like wars or civil wars between communities. So they have wanted a consensus. So people now want peace. So they often try to have a democratic institution. So in most cases, you have a democratic institution, which means that when there are divides, there often leads to like natural selection of like policies which can tackle these divides. So that's why often like huge countries like India where there were like multiple differences, you had like, even though it's not like ethnic federalism, you still have a federalistic state of government where you have proportional representation in terms of like having like certain seats being given to the in parliament being reserved for the communities based on the population of these communities. These are things that can still happen. The difference is on their side, a particular area is like dedicated for a particular ethnicity and a particular community. On our side, you just have like reservation, so the people who are from minorities can often are able to tackle the problems that comes with competing against the majority, so they're able to get some reservation on our side and are able to get represented. That is our comparative, where you still have representational federalism and where you still have certain seats being given. The reason why this is going to be far better than anything that government wants to say is multifold. Firstly, notice in terms of the like direct harm, which opening government does not talk about. Often it's hard to displace, i.e. that this debate has to happen once the conflict has ended. So people are not necessarily separated on ethnic lines. So there are still going to be like minorities in a certain community, in a certain area, in a geographical province, and they cannot displace or move to like a place where they are majorities, because often it's harder to move and harder to like travel to a different place, especially after conflict, because of like lack of resources. So often what happens is that the geographical lines are made and there are going to be like minorities within these geographical provinces. That is something that happens on their side. But which means that even if like one area is dedicated to an ethnicity, there's still going to be minorities who cannot even vote, because like that particular area is designated for the majority ethnicity. So they are politically disenfranchised. And second, they're often treated in worst possible way. So legitimization of like hatred, legitimization of rights for certain community is increased on their side. If you don't buy this, the second problem is that often there are religious divides that happens because of post-conflict, because of the conflict, which means there is schisms that happen in religion. So there's still going to be like people within a certain community who do not get along. I.e., if it's like India and we have like a particular area for Muslims, there's still going to be like sects of Muslims or like sects of Christian people who might not agree with each other. So even between a certain ethnicity, there can be sub-ethnic groups who may not get along. So all the benefits that Gov wants to say that we can have at least communal development, they have to say why you have unity between these communities, which means there's still going to be similar harms that they pose on us on their side. Rather, on their side, it's going to be these people are going to be far more politically disenfranchised. Why necessarily are we better? First, in terms of why we have better political representation. Notice on our side, there's going to be more inclusive campaigning, i.e. that you are able to like have because there's going to be electoral blocks in terms of so representatives have to like people and politicians have to go ahead and cater to different blocks as a whole. So they can't go ahead and say that we just care about this particular community. They often have to say why they care about the other communities also, so they can get some votes even from them. Especially when you have heterogeneous population, that is the only way you can guarantee to get most votes. Second is in terms of just get alliances. The reason why like you do not have alliances on their side is that once it's designated that like the Muslims would be the ones who would be elected in this particular area, then you do not have the need to like go ahead and ally in another place where you cannot necessarily contest. On our side, because there's no like clear divide, so you can always have alliances. So like even if there is a certain like a Hindu dominated political group, they would still want to have allies with the other minor community groups, because that's the way they are able to win elections, or because if they have alliances, they're able to maintain majority in the parliament, which means that they're able to have collaborative policy. The third thing is that often we have better policy unification. On their side, side, like states or the ethnic provinces just care about their own province. They don't care about national interest policies like security, like having like foreign trade, which means it's often tougher to get into any sort of agreement on like national issues because they care about, oh, let's just build more ports on our side, or let's just try to have some like set some industries on our side, which means they often care only about the provinces because that's the way they can get voted. On our side, the national issues can be talked much further because like representatives often like represent the people as a whole, and these are something that you campaign on to say that we'll ensure that security happens. So they only care about internal security of the provinces. On our side, we're able to like tackle the national issues, which means that representation is better. Yes, I'll take the pair from CG.
Cool. You yourself say that these minorities will be scattered across geographical areas, which means that the parties only want to cater to the majority and do not listen to these people.
No, so if they are scattered across, so in every like constituency, they need the like support of those different voting blocks. So they often, at least notionally, they try to do something, or they at least have someone represented. But second, we tell you how we can still have parliamentary representation on our side, which makes it better. Second, I want to say on social unification. Notice the reason why contact theory unlocks on our side is that you have reduction of stereotypes in like because people are able to connect with each other and they do not see them on a stereotypical lens. And the fact that you do not see them as, oh, they are being more prosperous than us, because you often have economic functioning. I.e., if you live in a certain, like if it's like a certain place where Hindus and Muslims live together, then they rely on each other because one, they are producing good which is supplied by the other community. So there is economic integration which makes them not hate them as much. On their side is where you are like within a particular province, you are like self-fulfilled. So you don't have an incentive to like to interact with others. So that it increases the divide, especially when you see certain communities or certain provinces becoming better. Second is that we have like common schools of schools and institutions where the next generation study without having biases, so they can interact with each other, play football with each other, so they do not see them with a racist lens. So in long term, we're able to reduce the divide that like Garvit wants to talk about. So it's only on our side where contact theory unlocks, and we're able to reduce like the problems of communalism. Conversations proud.
I thank the speaker for that very fine speech. With that, calling upon the DPM. Here.
Hi, I hope I'm clearly audible as well as visible.
Your voice is breaking. Maybe if you turn your camera off.
Just a second. I have changed my network. Is it better now?
Yep,
Hello?
much better. Yep.
Great. I'll just give one short clip to video if it's still starting. If not, just let me know and I'll switch it off. Is it still holding up fine?
No, yeah, it works.
Perfect. Setting up my own timer. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Problem with opening opposition is that they try to base the case on India. Unfortunately, it's not the right example. Go and revisit their case. All of which they've picked up, all the premises are based on the society you currently see around in India. Unfortunately, post-conflict societies are not structured that way. I will go ahead and break all of those assertions, but first of all, let's break down the fact that people will feel unfairly treated because some regions will be lucky geographically and some regions will be unlucky. Some regions will have ports, some regions will have natural resources, some regions will have rivers, etc. And some regions have fertile land, some regions won't have fertile land. Idea is this is a symmetric problem. I don't think on their side also you magically solve this problem because regions will be divided on either side and some region will end up being richer than the other region. It is symmetric problem that happens all around the world. I'm unsure as to how opening opposition or any opposition provides a unique solution for that. And I'm unsure as to why it becomes an exclusive harm on our side. This geographical lottery, this is symmetric. Then this idea that these people are actually not living with community, and there are regions where certain communities are in minority and they're actually living a mingled life. Notice they pick this up from the same premise as, oh, look at a country like India, the Hindu Muslims living together in some regions. Unfortunately, post-conflict states don't operate that way. There are three reasons why post-conflict states actually have communities flocking together, unlike what O wants you to believe. A, these people were literally out for each other's head a few months back. When civil wars are happening, when people are fighting in conflict, to stick together and flock together with who they feel safe, i.e., they're more likely to stick together with people of their own community. Hence, communities are more likely to be found together in a particular region. They're generally regions on X side of the river. There are people who from one community, on the other side, people from Y community, and they were generally fighting. That's why they flock together. But second idea, movement within a country also happens based on economic opportunities. The reason I'm sitting in Delhi 700 kilometers away from my hometown is the fact that I have a job here. And similar reasons exist for people moving for the various better economic opportunities. But because these states are coming out of conflicts, they did not have those incentives of so-called employment. They were just out for survival. And when you're out for survival, you tend to stick together with your family. Notice what happened in COVID. Everyone just wanted to go back to their families. This is the reason why communities are more likely to be flocked together. Families or cultural integrities are more likely to be flocked together. This is the reason why it makes sense to go ahead and draw these lines geographically, because these people are already living together. But thirdly, I think this completely breaks down opening opposition's case. The idea of a better inclusive marketing, or giving them quotas for minority leaders who magically go ahead and implement policies, is all uncertain. Because notice panel, I don't know whether this leader gets elected, and I think CG has a valid POI to that if you are a minority community living in a majority area, why will a leader care about your demands in the first place? But the second idea is the fact that why will these community members trust any other community member to represent their interest? These people are not coming out of a rosy situation. They're coming out of situations of high mistrust. The same community member could have been out there for their head a few months back. Why would now they go ahead and trust this individual to be put in power? What this does is what happens on CG's paradigm, even in CG's best case, if they're somehow able to magically give them this reservation and get leaders in power, there will be this constant mistrust, which means you will never fully trust these individuals to put your interest first. And that is the problem that leads to that the Saatvik points out in terms of harms, which means these people now get restless for their own representation, for their own state. And that is where fractionalization of the state can happen further. Flip it on our side. On our side, we are willing to give them direct concessions upfront by offering this federal ethnicity structures. How? Saatvik already tells you that these people will have their regional autonomy on policy. This is something O cannot guarantee. This is something CO cannot guarantee. Only Gov, as per the Infoslide, guarantees these policies, and this looks like stuff like right to education and culture on their own terms, religious freedom, ability to practice things on their own, special provisions in their statewide legal system to decide whether there can be a constitution of a nation, but that region can have its own provisions within that constitution to decide what is right, what is wrong, as per their own cultural governance system. And lastly, ethnic quotas for people in power, i.e., if I'm living in a region and I have the police force of the same region, I'm more likely to trust it. But if I put people such as police force, civil servants, and people in a post-conflict state with power or extreme authority of some other community within this region, it creates more mistrust. It does not give me the security that my children are safe in this community. I'm more likely to think whether my future actually exists over here. Because notice panel, these people do not have historic precedents to go their way. Right now, I continue to live in a democracy because I have historic precedents that even if a minority leader comes to power, even if a majority leader comes to power, I'm more likely than not going to go ahead and continue living a decently good life. These people don't have that precedence going this way. Hence, you need to offer them something to build their trust, because in a post-conflict states, what O tries to prioritize things like national trade, foreign policy are all far-fetched. The first thing I have to do is ensure that I grow enough cattle and livestock and grains within my own country to feed my own people. That happens through cooperation. How do you allow these people to cooperate? By giving them some of their own concessions, and that is when they start realizing that it's worth living in this state. They will probably start seeing semblance of some sort of a future, and that is what goes ahead and forces them, that is what goes and inspires them to go ahead and live like this. Before I move on, CEO.
Oftentimes, outcome of a post-conflict leads to one party end up becoming winner. Why exactly does you getting a state unit ends up creating trust when there is a higher mistrust because of you having a power dynamic within state?
Yeah, because idea is that is symmetric. The framing is that is symmetric. But on our side, we at least give them a small state where their legal precedents matter, where their cultures are followed first, where they have the policies feared to go ahead and administer rights as per their culture. Even if you say the worst case framing is symmetric, we still have some power with the state coming into power. Secondly, I think O has this weird idea that you need to go ahead and allow people to interact and trust itself. Understand, because if they're willing to be divided and governed on ethnic likes, why would have civil wars would have happened in the first place? I think these people are closely attached to their ancestral land, and we need to go ahead and give them that. I think any comparative on opposition is worse off, because if you don't have ethnic federalism, I'm unsure as to how you offer these people the concessions they need to trust you. And if you don't offer them the trust, I'm unsure as to how you get these people to go ahead and work with the same communities that were out there for their head a few months ago. If that doesn't happen, I don't think you will go ahead and rebuild this community. The biggest impact on which OG wins this debate is very simple, that by giving them these direct concessions, even if in the long term we don't achieve a lot, but in the short term we are able to give them this feeling that we might not die in this place, and we probably will get food in this place. Those two basic concessions allow them to continue living in this state, which avoids further violence, because the biggest harm we are able to oppose through these states. Very proud to win from OG.
I thank the speaker for that very fine speech. With that, calling upon the DLA. Here.
Hi, just give me 20 seconds for my notes.
Yeah, while we're on that, Umu, could you please stop sharing your screen? Yeah, thank you.
I just want to confirm if I'm both audible and visible clearly.
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect. Shout out to SR Depsa, because I think our junior team reached the finals as well. Shout out to Navakanth for being a fantastic teammate, and shout out to Saksham and Vishwesh for being in the audience. And shout out to Arshi for feeding me today lunch and dinner. Starting, POS preferably after the fifth from closing Gov. If not CG, then I'll take OG for sure. Starting on a self count of 3, 2, and 1. OG is yet to answer the question of cost. The cost that is incurred to numerous people that are now likely to be displaced. Numerous minorities that are now are forced to leave from their ancestral land simply because the government has now divided people on the basis of ethnicity. On the comparative, on our side of the world, at least these minorities in these majority-ridden lands would have had some degree of voting power, that they could have voted for some legislative representative who would have talked about their issues to some degree within the state legislatures. On their side of the world, these people now literally have no voting rights within their ancestral lands, and now are forced to relocate from their houses to a newer and distant lands where they have to literally ditch all of their earnings, all of their assets that they have accumulated over the past multiple years during the course of these conflicts as well. Which means government teams necessarily need to cater to the cost that is incurred to these people on an emotional level, to also have attachment to the land, even though it is ridden by a majority-ridden population. But at the same time, the economic cost that it incurs to transport shit tons of people towards newer areas in and of itself. The second cost that government benches necessarily need to cater to is the capacity for governments to essentially develop large amounts of social infrastructure for these people. Which is to say, I don't think a lot of these communities on their own have the capacity to build full-fledged schools, full-fledged hospitals, and so on and so forth. And the reason this is important is because different ethnicities have different mediums of education, different kinds of propaganda that they want to spew through their education, different kinds of healthcare treatments that they want to provide to a lot of these people, which implies that not a lot of these. So
like a lot of these ethnicities have different incentives and different modus operandis in this, but they don't have the resources that is required to undertake a significant amount of this, which means it then becomes on the onus of the government, or rather the central government, to provide a lot of these resources at large, to ensure that all of these ethnicities have the capacity to practice their own social or like economic norms in the first place. The reason this is important is because insofar as the post-colonial state, governments now have to heavily prioritize on the funding that they provide towards these social causes, and they have to deprioritize a lot of other things which can probably look like bank policies or like security policies and so on and so forth, which also requires significant amount of funding. Which means at all points in time, I don't know why the government has the capacity to do all of this in the first place. They necessarily need to cater to this. But on that absurd POI that comes from CG on why you have an incentive, we think insofar that this is fragmented ethnicities, oftentimes these ethnicities are probably not big enough to win national elections, but they're big enough to probably win constituencies, which means based on the motion of kingmakers, I think it's fairly like reasonable for us to assume that there will exist a large number of these kingmakers and there will exist a large number of these swing voters at large who could potentially decide an election, which means there's an incentive. But secondly, these people just got out of a conflict, which means they're heavily empowered, which means if they realize that their incentives are not being adhered to by like the topmost positions of the government, they have all the more incentive to fight back, because fighting back has worked in the past for these people, which means they have an incentive to really fuck over the central government, which is why any leader of the government, like from the central government, at least within the short run, has an incentive to ensure that the level of these policies are reasonable and equitable at best. Which means at all given points in time, OG has to prove like capacity in order to win this debate, especially CG. But moving on then, on the harms of this policy, we think as a result of ethnic divide, oftentimes religious leaders or ethnic leaders at large are forced to like prioritize more amounts of these conservative narratives at large. Why is this true, right? The intuition here is that oftentimes, like in the 1600s, where Orthodox, like Christians, especially in Central Asia, were forced to be a lot more conservative to protect like Christians against like the heavily proselytizing nature of Muslims within that particular region at large, which is why they had an incentive to ensure that the Orthodox Christians within that region were far more conservative. They forced people to come more to the church. They forced like ensured that marriage practices were a lot more conservative and ensured that people had to rely on the church a lot more. This is precisely what is going to happen alongside government, where the level of education is going to be far more conservative, far more like on the nature of spewing bad narratives against the other ethnic group at large. The reason they're likely to do this is also because the pre-existing narratives or pre-existing hatred that people have for different communities at large. Why is the comparative better, and why are we able to ensure the society becomes better in the long run? The first is on the general notion of contact theory. We think insofar, like on both sides of the world, religions will strive to spew bad narratives at large. But the difference is on where people are able to think for themselves. Within our side of the world, people are likely to be in contact with each other because one, they're forced to work with each other at the workplace, or probably because in a business, probably the suppliers are a member of a different ethnicity, or probably because in public institutions such as schools and universities and restaurants, you are forced to interact with people with different perspectives, presumably different ethnicities. But lastly, we think there's an added incentive of conflict fatigue, wherein people are just tired of fighting, and they realize that probably this fighting is as a result of political powers or religious leaders having their ego clashes. So the common man probably realizes that, oh, I don't really hate you as much. So there's some degree of conflict fatigue. Also, there's something that is likely to accrue. As a result of that, we think when there is scope for more amounts of conversation, we think there is scope for more amounts of perspective sharing, wherein you realize that, oh, even though my religious leader said they're all like different different ethnicities are bad, this person doesn't seem to be so bad. He seems like an individual who's very similar to my ideologies as well, or who's probably just as much of a nice person. You also witness multiple acts of service, or you have feelings of
POI from
compassion for a
Frozen.
member of a different community at large, which means at the very end, we think people have greater scope to think for themselves only when they have communication or contact with the different groups. POI from CG.
Cool. Do you think that better policies or support from the state or elections are the tipping point for minorities in post-conflict states?
No. So on our side of the world, we tell you that when you have more conversations with different individuals, like we don't think every individual is likely to be hardlined and bad. Like even in the short run, if there's likely to be some degree of kerfuffles or conflicts at large, when more amounts of people realize that the other individual is not as bad as their religious leaders tell them to be, we think only on our side of the world can people start to think for themselves, which means it's exclusive that on our side of the world, religions aren't as powerful in ensuring that people are conservative and highly polarized on our side of the world. Which means at the very least, right, we think children, as they start to grow older, they're likely to be a lot more liberal in their ideologies because they tend to ask a lot of questions. They ask why this religious leader is being so bad when their friend at school doesn't seem to be as bad as the religious leader told them to be, which means at the very least, we think in the long run, there is a greater scope for people to be a lot more harmonious. This doesn't exist on side government simply because you force people in ghettos and you prevent them from actually interacting with each other in the very least, which means if there's no capacity to interact, there's no possibility of there being any kind of long-term interaction in the future because their beliefs are never questioned by actual reality and they're reliant on religious proselytization.
I thank the speaker for that very fine speech. With this, calling upon member of government to start with the closing remarks. Here.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yeah, you are.
Starting in 30, I'd prefer to take a POI, preferably from opening post the 5th. Shout outs first to Pratap for being an absolutely wonderful partner this entire tournament. Also to Akshat and Keshav and the rest of Hindu Depsoc who did absolutely great this tournament. Starting in 10 seconds, just organizing my notes. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I want to explain within this debate is that policy isn't the tipping point. Because note that you're in a post-conflict state, which means both the state and minorities do not have economic or political capacity to be able to take actively changing actions. Which means even if you go ahead and have better representation within elections or within the parliament, it's unclear to what extent these states have monetary capacity to go ahead and be able to take action. This is instrumental because this pushes both opening houses out of this debate. Because this explains why you don't have capacity to go ahead and take action and why you need external actors to go ahead and actively interfere. I want to first explain why post-conflict states are economically fragile. Note that when you're having an active war within your state, this destroys infrastructure and productivity. This looks like roads, schools, hospitals, factories that are actively bombed, abandoned, burnt, etc. within riots. 2, you think your domestic industries like agriculture, etc. collapses because these farmlands are either deserted or mined or probably are actively gone ahead and abandoned, which means your domestic industries like probably go ahead and collapse. But 3, the active trade that you have just generally gets disrupted, which means you have little tax base as the state, but also you can't go ahead and deliver basic services. Note 2, we think you have an educated elites, probably skilled professionals, entrepreneurs, or just rich people in general who are probably part of these minorities, or probably people who are just scared to live in a post-conflict state, go ahead and flee as refugees. Because A, they don't want their businesses to suffer, but 2, they fear for their safety, which means both the poor but also the rich actively flee, either when they're part of minorities, but also because the majority fear that this might reach their doorsteps, etc., which means they flee as well. Note that these diasporas hold enormous financial resources, but they withhold them because they don't trust the state and are afraid to go ahead and come back because they don't know what's going to happen. Third, we think at all points of time, you're actively dependent on a few commodities, which look like oil, minerals, or probably just cash crops in general. And the central government has incentive to exploit these resources and funnel wealth into states that are dominant controlled, which means at all points of time, it's unclear why policy then is the tipping point within this debate. This pushes both opening government and opening opposition out of this debate because they're never actively able to prove why state has capacity to be able to actually improve lives of citizens in general. The second thing I want to explain, and this is important, is why these wars happen in the first place. The first thing I want to explain is that these are probably never about policy, because note at a point in time when these are things about like taxes or budgets or probably jobs, these are people who have been historically oppressed for a really long time. This explains that even if you have worse policies in general, you probably don't experience as much of a shift in your present day to life, or even if you have better policies, it doesn't impact you as much because you've been like historically suffering, which means at all points of time, these are not things as proximate to you in general, which means these ethnic conflicts are largely driven either by religion or by culture or by language or stuff like that. Note at a point in time, and this removes both opening opposition and closing opposition out of this debate. Note that at a point in time when you have just states existing, your ways or your institutions where you express culture and language and your own history is something that's still actively not provided to you on both opposition benches, which means that at all points of time, it's unclear why your likely to go ahead and just switch in terms of policy change or in terms of electoral or representative change, because you don't have the space to still practice things that are incredibly proximate to you, which looks like your ethnicity, culture, religion, etc. Which means the only way you can go ahead and practice is when you have safe spaces where you're actively able to go ahead and set up these institutions in terms of like religious temples, or in terms of education. I'll take that was the fifth, or in terms of schools that go ahead and preserve your education, or in terms of just like cultural houses, or where you can just unite, or like parks, whatever, where you can unite and actively like collaborate in like cultural practices. This explains that the things that are proximate to you, which is your identity, which are still being erased, never are something that change on government and don't change on op. Which means at a point in time when you don't get these spaces on op, these post-conflict states are still likely to go ahead and result in more and more conflict anyway, precisely because the core argument within here is never resolved. Which means in majoritarian spaces, you probably can't build the 7-foot mosque that you want anyway, but you probably can't go ahead and like practice like, I don't know, like bhangra or whatever at all points of time. This explains why at any point of time money or policy is not the tipping point, but it's whether you have these cultural like experiences as a part of the minority, so you feel your identity is still protected. Because note, at the point in time when you're uneducated, when you're illiterate, it's difficult for you to perceive the difference in policy or perceive the difference in budgetary requirements, etc., etc. But also it's easy to brainwash you when it comes to government propaganda, because government doesn't want a job anyway, which means policies don't become the tipping point, proximate things do. The third extension I want to explain is just why international relations and peacekeeping are something that click in on our side of the house. Note why international actors matter in post-conflict states. Two reasons for this. One, we think fragile states cannot rebuild alone for all the reasons I give you, which means after civil war, governments are bankrupt, you don't have institutions, militaries are fragmented, your populations are displaced, which means peacekeeping missions like the UN, the NATO, etc., go ahead and actively have to provide immediate security, or they think they do. Two, donors and lenders, which look like World Bank, IMF, EU, NGOs, etc., fund reconstruction and service delivery, and this only happens on government. I will explain that. But third, and this is important, we think neighboring states and regional powers within this can either sponsor or stabilize borders within this, which means that at all points of time, neighboring states that either want to probably capture more land for capitalist tendencies, or you want more regional power, which means you actively want to show that you can interfere, have incentives to interfere when fragile states themselves are weak, because they have international justification to interfere. I want to go ahead and make this out. One, note that at all points of time, you have sham peace agreements if this power is centralized, which means one, minorities know that the majority can dominate again once these foreign actors leave. But two, foreign actors also know this, which means peacekeepers, donors, peacekeeping missions don't go ahead and leave at any points of time. This leaves your way open to a lot more foreign intervention in general that is unlikely to leave, or more likely to go ahead and exploit resources. But two, they're unlikely to go ahead and invest in your country at all points of time because they're worried how the majority is likely to misuse this. But two, we think disempowered ethnic groups reject peace frameworks that are implemented by majorities in general, and they turn to external patrons when you don't have internal stability. This looks like the Kosovo Serbs turning to Serbia, or like the South Sudanese factions going ahead and turning to Uganda or Sudan, or what. This is protected Abel, which means these conflicts become internalized. But lastly, these neighbors or people who have incentive to go ahead and actively interfere can justify meddling because they claim to go ahead and defend oppressed minorities within this when you don't have clear boundaries. Note how, and I want to just make this out, how ethnic federalism fixes this is that you give credible guarantees for peacekeepers and donors, which means at all points of time, when you have this constitutional settlement that happens, that explains why the majority can't go ahead and actively interfere within these areas, or they don't have control over administrative policy. You get more money from foreign actors, which directly goes in and helps the state, but also these people. But two, you have long-term aid and peace-building support that doesn't go ahead and inflict on your like autonomy, which looks like donors and IFIs and World Bank helping reconstruction aid because they're reassured that you are actually not going to hamper on the rights of the democracy. But thirdly, you have migration and diaspora going ahead and coming back into you, both wealthy donors that are actively able to think that they can come back to the state because they have legitimacy, but they also have economic power to go ahead and come back. But lastly, you reduce neighboring states' excuse for meddling, which just helps you because you don't have military support to counter them anyway. With that, vote for closing government.
I thank the speaker for that very fine speech. With that, calling upon member of opposition. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep, you are.
Yeah, Anshuman going MO. I'll take opening government. Just verbalize your POI. Please do verbalize your POI. I was only seeing the chat. So whenever you want to ask a POI, just Unmute insane. Give me time. I'll drink water and then I'll start. Okay, I'll start on my first word. I'll first push CG out of the round. They claim that the tipping point here is not policy, it's identity preservation. Except if GovBench is correct, most of these communities are living together all the time in these areas anyways, which means that these communities can like enjoy their identity together. If this is about traditional practices, about what kind of food you eat or what kind of dresses you wear, it's quite unclear if these communities are already living together at Gov. Why do you need this kind of shift in the first place? Why do you need to give them administrative freedom so that they can pursue their cultural practices as long as OG analysis is that these people are already living together? It's quite unclear why CG's clash on identities makes sense. So it's quite unclear what CG is trying to achieve by making this. I'll have one call out at opening government, because notice they're completely the positive is completely underanalyzed here, because notice they never actually prove to you why these communities will end up becoming interconnected later on. Their only analysis on this is that, bro, you will have greater trust once you can trust the government. Except it's quite unclear why, just because you're living with your own people, the hatred you have for other communities dies down. Which is to say, if my grandfather was or if my father was killed by somebody from the other community, and I passed down those stories to my children and people like all of my generation, that these people targeted us and these people hunted us down, it's quite unclear why, just because they live separately, they will end up becoming more interconnected. So it's quite unclear where OG is trying to lead to. Take you later. It's just 1:30. So it's quite unclear what the comparative analysis on opening government is to ensure that stability reaches and there is more interconnectedness on GovBench particularly. But I'll have two extensions at closing opposition. The first thing I'll explain is I'll actually explain why these deals often happen in bad ways. And this is going to be better analysis than opening opposition telling you that there is random natural selection, which is why some people get resources, some people do not get resources. The second thing I'll do is explain the positive on interconnectedness, and then explain actually why this interconnectedness later on happens much better on our side of the house through different mechanisms. The first thing then is in terms of why these deals happen in bad ways. Notice the time period at which this kind of negotiation and this resource sharing is happening. Because what is fiat at government is that you will give them administrative control and you will give them policy control. What is not fiat is how these administrative controls or these resources are likely to be distributed in the first place, because that is not what the particular fiat within the motion is. Notice that the time at which and the point at which these deals are happening is a time that both benches concede is a time of extreme crisis, which means a lot of times the instability within this region is differently spread out. Which is to say, a lot of times the instability within particular regions are more common, like minority regions are more common than the trade hubs. Think about areas like Kolkata that were far more stable in the time of post-conflict than other areas like Odisha, for example. What this specifically shows is that there is a distribution gap within the resources that happens at the point at which this negotiation happens in the first place. This means that there's a difference in the kind of leverage you have to actually bargain for change. Because notice a lot of communities are really desperate because they lack resources, while other communities are not as desperate because they have comparatively more resources than the communities that lack resources. What this specifically shows to you is because of this leverage, the majority communities and the communities that have more resources can leverage this gap as a way to gridlock and not share resources until they get a better end of the deal in the first place. What this specifically shows to you is that a lot of times the way in which this resource is distributed and permanently distributed on government is happening in a time of crisis where there is a lot of desperation that the minority communities are able people are willing to accept any kind of unfair deal that happens on their side of the house. But OG is right to point out that this might be uncomparative. This might also happen on our side of the house. Except the tipping point is how permanent this is, which is to say, we'll prove at a point in time where at uniquely at closing opposition, where you're more interconnected. At that time, it becomes easier for you to leverage your resources later on. But specifically, I want to get into the major part of this extension. Why is interconnectedness the tipping point here, and why does interconnectedness actually gather stability for most regions in the first place? But before that, why does this interconnectedness particularly not happen on their side of the house? Notice what kind of administrative policies pass in these areas at a point in time where they're distributed communally. What the kind of policies that are passed are policies like what communal workers you hire, and what kind of what communities reservation do workers get. But secondly, who can open up a business, and who is allowed to get those kinds of grants to open like a particular trade, or who is allowed to negotiate within other states particularly. What this particularly means is that the policies that are likely to be passed on their side of the house, once you give these states administrative control, and especially at a point in time where they hate other communities in the first place, what they specifically do is they lock out other communities from entering this area. This is a better mechanism than opening opposition, because opening opposition just assumes that the people are already living here. But even if people are not living here, they are locked out from ever entering here because of the policies, the kind of reservations you give these people in your own communities, and the kind of policies you pass towards your own communities in the first place. Which means there's a massive shift in incentive for any kind of migration, any kind of trade occurring interstate, and any kind of barrier that you have particularly. Before I actually complete the positive opening government,
I am threatened of other ethnicities' growth when I don't trust them to respect my right to life. But having ethnic federalism allows me to believe that my growth is controlled by my people and my region. Hence, I'm more able to feel less threatened and allow for collaborative growth.
no, I
Engage.
agree that you would think that your growth is controlled by your own community if you think that you got a fair deal. Except I'm sure that due to the difference in leverage, you do not think that you got a fair deal because you were severely undergranted because of how desperate these communities were. But specifically, the narratives don't go away about how these people like particularly attacked each other in the first place. So the distrust still continues, because even if the deal is fair, it is perceived to not be fair because of how different states develop differently. But why does interconnectedness specifically solve this problem? Notice the way in which interconnectedness works. You have greater migration because people have different needs. Some people want to particularly get into the IT sector, which is why they move to Bangalore. Some people want to get into finance, they move to Delhi. Some people particularly want to do specific kinds of things, which is why they often move to other areas, which is what consolidates these people within those specific areas in the first place. Which means that the states are far more interconnected on our side of the house, because there's greater migration, there's greater trade happening between these areas in the first place. What this specifically means is that you cannot landlock these areas from being unstable in the first place, which means that on government, because you're far more isolationist as a state, what the policies you can pass is you can cut off river supply from these states, you can cut off water supply from these states, because that does not affect you, but that fulfills your election incentives of telling the people that, look, the other state is doing much worse than we are doing, which specifically means that you can destabilize other states when you do not have the incentive to promote stability due to the interconnectedness that you have particularly, which is why interconnectedness is the tipping point.
I thank the speaker for that very fine speech. With that, calling upon the Garvit whenever you're ready. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Yeah, shout out to Yuvraj Bhaiya for hitting me up like 5 minutes before check-in saying that we should do this. Shout out to Hindu Depsok, shout out to Akshat and Keshav. Yeah, Keshav, that's what you get. You get clashed out. Anyway, cool. Just give me a second. I'll start in 15. Starting in 3, 2, 1. some direct rebuttals to LO. They say that, oh, you can never go ahead and like form some sort of consensus when it comes to national issues. We simply think that is not true. That is not how a federal system works. It merely means that there is some division of power. States do get some amount of power over certain things. This looks like them deciding what sort of language do we teach in schools, or what sort of like things that we place more value to, or in terms of like the healthcare facilities that they have. We think there's a clear distinction between things of national importance that concern everybody, such as like the national currency that you have, or the sort of foreign policy that you have, or like other things like simply on the idea of sovereignty, right? We think that insofar as that is true, it is completely uncharitable for them to say that, oh, the center would never step in if one state just arbitrarily decides to go ahead and like stop the river flow. We think that it is extreme for them to say this, because what they fail to account for is that the sort of feeling of like hatred that these ethnicities have towards one another drastically goes down immediately after the implementation of this policy. What I mean is that initially when you have these conflicts coming up, these are largely because you have certain ethnicities feeling that they're not being represented, or they feel that the majority is like imposing their language on them, or is taking away their culture, etc. Which means the very fact that you go ahead and give these certain concessions to them through this ethnic federalism drastically reduces their incentives to go ahead and like still continue to hate these people. But also we believe that they have more immediate concerns, such as like skill, like developing skills amongst their own population, because Yuvraj Bhaiya already tells you that these people largely lack the capacity to like develop, etc. Which means that the primary concern is not going to be like fuck around with other states, but rather to ensure that they're able to sustain themselves in the first place. But second, if their idea is that, oh, we get interconnectedness because you have like people like migrating, or you have like people talking, etc., we think that the reason why that does not necessarily pan out is because, a, when you have like multiple ethnicities living within a particular city, etc., and their idea is that, oh, these children interact with each other, that does not necessarily pan out, because we believe that it is precisely when these people are so much in contact with each other that there is some sort of protectionism that occurs in terms of like how parents upbring their kids. This looks like them like constantly villainizing kids from like other like their other neighborhoods, etc. We think that insofar as that is true, and children are largely impressionable, then they're going to come up and like form these biases in the first place. The reason why this changes on our side is when you're living far away from these other people, there is no need to villainize them in the first place. We don't think that necessarily happens on our side. Their idea on culture and identity is that, oh, people still live together, they already still have identity. We don't think that the extent to which this culture or identity is maintained is going to be the same on their side, because if I as a Telugu have to like go to school and study Hindi, something that is imposed by the center on me, I will feel that it is an attack on my culture and identity. I won't feel that my culture is protected simply because I'm living like with people like me. But second, they totally fail to account for the fact that LO's entire framing is on the idea that some minorities will still live in other areas with majorities, etc. We think that, even if their idea is that these minorities will have to be displaced, we think that is totally fine, simply because of the fact that the comparative will be much worse for them. It is precisely because of the fact that like they're like small in number, that they have no community support there. They probably won't be able to find a job because the majority is going to discriminate against them, etc. Which means that even if it is a short-term harm for them to go ahead and like displace to these other areas, we think that the community that they relocate to have all the incentives to ensure that they're treated much better. We think then if their call out is that, oh, like if member of op says that, oh, why are people going to forgive people for the past crimes, etc., then I'm unsure as to why this does not happen more on comparative when the person who killed my grandfather is living next to me. What are our unique extensions, and I want to impact them out first. We think that on the idea of like these nations have like largely like economic problems, etc., the way that this changes overall in the longer run on our side is simply because you get better like economic development
why?
because of ownership and accountability later. We think that when groups directly control resources within their regions, they develop stronger incentives to go ahead and like build local governance capacity. This looks like infrastructure or service delivery. On comparative, it is much easier for their constituency leaders to just blame the leaders for everything. We think that the reason why that changes is, one, these ethnic groups, and this counters DLO's idea on like conservatism, etc., they're constantly competing with like other ethnic groups in like other states, etc. They want to be the most developed. They want to ensure that their most potentially good people, etc., do not migrate to other countries or other states. It's because they want to give them the best opportunities here, etc. We think that insofar as that incentive exists, they have all the incentives to go ahead and modernize, etc. But we also believe that you still have like certain extent of globalization that still takes place. We don't think that they're grow up in a completely homogeneous culture, etc. Second, we think that, and this is what Yuvraj tells you on the idea of like attracting foreign aid and investment. We think that donors and investors like hesitate to pour resources into like centralized failed states because they fear that there will be a capture by like these singular majority groups, etc. We think that insofar as that is true, there is just like better utilization of resources on our end. But lastly, we think that this creates resilience against authoritarian relapses, because if you still go ahead and like give power to like the majority, etc., then we think that post-conflict states are more likely to fall into a dictatorship simply when one group goes ahead and like captures the center. This is precisely what happened in Uganda or Rwanda at any points in time. Before that, POI opening.
By your own analysis, you have proven that religious and political leaders are incentivized to spread hateful narratives in order to keep people within their own ethnicity and not liberalize.
No, so like if let's say if in my neighborhood I'm with people of my belonging, but the immediate neighborhood is of another community, I'm more likely to have more sort of fear mongering or hatred because these people are of immediate proximity to me. This changes because these people are living very far away, but I also tell you that there are more important concerns. The most important thing, and this automatically makes us win over like every other house, is that we believe that the government has incentives and capacity to like allocate these budget and resources. First, simply because there are like self-preservation incentive of the state. We think that if they stop this process, then this only like further like makes the conflict or hatred worse. This makes them want to like secede, etc. The only way that the central government can maintain legitimacy is by guaranteeing that this budget transfer is going to be like fairer, etc. But we also think that you get like more international like extremism on your side. This looks like Russia justifying its annexation of Ukraine by saying that, oh, we want to save the Russian people that live there. We think that the reason why it changes on our side is because that these Russian people in the first place simply go back to their ethnic majority places at any points in time. But we also think why this does not break into secession is simply because the opportunity cost of these states then going ahead and like continuing hatred or like leaving, like opting out of these central governments is going to be harmful for them, because they benefit more from staying within these federation because they got the autonomy that they wanted, but they also get sovereignty from external threats, etc. But also that they don't lose out on like the interstate markets that they get or like the economic structures that they get. We think for all those reasons the state does have like incentives to ensure that they go ahead and develop. We think that insofar as that is true, we win. Stop to propose.
I thank the speaker for that very fine speech. With that, calling upon the opposition vote. Here.
Can I be heard?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, Khokher, before you start, I am to give shout outs. Shout out to Khokher for being a teammate. Shout out to Suhani and Samat for supporting me all the time. Thank you.
Okay, so I also want to give shout out to Anshuman for teaming up. A second time in a row. Last time we did DTU Monsoons, we were out in quarters on a split. I guess on a split. Never mind.
No,
And also shout out to Captured Upstock. Yeah, it was not a split. Yeah, I remember. Yes. The first thing I want to do is to note that economics is more important than identity for people. The reason this is true is that people have a revealed preference that they prioritize their economic rights as opposed to the culture that they're living in. Oftentimes, even within the most poverty-prone areas, you see women working within other households or opening their own boutiques. This is true even in the most patriarchal societies, because people want to earn more money. They want to improve their quality of life, which means that the incentive that we are targeting or the benefit that we're targeting on closing opposition ends up prioritizing or like giving benefit to more number of people, because we explain that the link between one state and the other state, if it's in economic terms, that ends up becoming more certain as opposed to any other thing in the round. This engages just with closing government idea that safe spaces are quite important. I want to extensively weigh against opening opposition in the round because I believe they have quite a bunch of things. The first thing opening opposition suggests is that the cost of moving from one area to other area is going to high. The issue with this is that it assumes the worst case of side government, that the outcome of war was extremely terrible and people are living in very, very worst pitches. I think opening government is correct to point out that it is not always the case and you are living within separate areas. So this claim on opening opposition is not really clear and not very certain. The second thing opening opposition tries to do is to explain that contact theory is going to work. And note, I want to note, like, this is the most proven argument on opening opposition. There are a bunch of reasons why this is not likely. This is not a very likely case, and closing opposition is more likely. The first reason for this is that of the mechanism on opening opposition to explain that contact theory is going to work is that if people stay together and they are obviously going to see that, oh, you are not that bad, so maybe you are going to befriend them. The issue with this is that that both of the top half team have already conceded that the hate narrative is quite strong enough. So presumably people are not always good. So in instances where you are having bad interaction, it can also lead to you having conflicts. So opening opposition outcome of contact theory may be working is uncertain because it is equally likely that micro interactions end up becoming worse and this contact theory is not likely to happen. But the second issue with opening opposition is that the assumption of contact theory is that people prioritize positive emotions more than the negative emotions. So in instances where you have bad interaction with someone who's not from your ethnic community, you tend to remember these specific emotions, which means that on opening opposition, if you want to believe contact theory is true, you also opening opposition also needed to explain that why contact theory is something which affects your interaction in a positive way affects everyday interaction with you in general. What exactly is closing opposition extension, which is relatively more certain? We at Member explain that if one state is engaging within trade with other state and the interconnected nature happens, this is relatively more certain. Why exactly is this true? It is true because oftentimes people existing within states have incentives to maybe expand themselves economically. And if the concession on the top half is that there are different things, for example, rivers exist in one place and maybe other things exist, like seas exist in other place, it is very likely that you want to leverage all of these kind of resources for your own business, which means that closing opposition, if we explain that one state engages with other state, that creates economic ties, it creates a stronger mechanism for one community to engage with other community. Why exactly is this very important on scale? The first thing it does is that it enforces the migration which opening government talks about. Because their mechanism suggests that people migrating from one area to other area, this is the DPM concession, is quite important because that is why people are going to agree to each other. Beyond closing opposition explain that once you are engaged with other communities economically, you're more likely to engage now. Why exactly this important? The first thing it does is that it creates some kind of deterrent. So if the issue in the round is that one community wants to fight against other community and there is a lot of tension, once you're economically tied against each other, it creates a stronger deterrence and you don't want to engage in bad relations with each other. The second issue with top half is that the leader of a mechanism which was dropped at DLO was that you are going to engage within politics and that is going to solve a lot of problems. But note, this analysis is very vulnerable to gov benches suggesting that there is going to be a lot of gridlocking, which is true in some instances, that policy changes oftentimes end up getting delayed. So opening opposition is not clear whether on positive, whether they are going to solve the problem within short term or not, because presumably on opening opposition, the policy change that they try to bring and to start state institutions, it is unlikely that happens. The last thing opening opposition that has is that maybe state institutions are going to get more opt-in, but it has suffers from the same problem that contact theory suffers. We are only going to opt in into state institutions if you actually trust them. But if the interaction with the other community is bad, presumably you don't really opt in. So it is unclear whether opening opposition is certain in that specific regard or not. That is why opening opposition is clearly losing to closing opposition. I want to engage with opening government then. So opening government's best case assumes that you are going to have state trust, and that is the best thing that you can happen. There are a bunch of issues with this. The first issue with this is that it is unclear why state trust is likely to happen. Presumably, the outcome of state trust is contingent upon the agreement that you have within the power sharing, which means that if you are only going to have state trust if your ethnic leader was successful in explaining, successful in dividing the resources for you, which means that if the ethnic leader is unsuccessful and is suggesting that maybe we have failed, it creates more and more distrust, and you are more incentivized to engage within conflict within long term. What's the weighing for this? So even if opening government is correct, and then some state trust happen, there are equally likely that some states are going to happen which are not trusting their own state. Oftentimes, the states who are not trusting their own governments end up creating more instances of conflict and creating more hate narratives, which means that opening government state trust, even if that exists, that is not important. The second thing, not right now, even if opening government is correct and state trust happens, there is no impacting on opening government. What does state trust lead to? Maybe it leads to opt-in into state institutions. But the issue with this is that even if state trust happens and you try to opt in, the way leaders manifest this narrative is that you have to stay within your own community, and if you try to go out, you're not being loyal to your own community. Why exactly is this detrimental to development? Oh, before that, yes, OG, shoot.
Whether O's contact theory and your idea of migration and engaging in business with other communities both require a prerequisite of trusting the state as well as the other community will not kill me like they're willing to a few months back. OG proves how this trust is established.
Okay, so let's just complete. Like I was just engaging with this. Like, so even if you are explaining that there is some development happening because of state trust, I want to note that the benefit of state trust is that people have better life. But there is a equally likely chance that you end up creating worse life because cultures inherently are not important. You end up cracking down among minority, for example, women, etc. That you can't really go out for opportunities because the other people are going to affect you because of the disparity between the agreement that happens. Which means that even if you are having some state trust, the insecurity that the state specifically has ends up creating worse life for these people. This is comparative on our side, and we read this better because we explained that the people, if they are connected economically, ends up opening more economic opportunities, which means that we have some margin on explaining that quality of life for us on our side, the house is going to become better. Lastly, engaging with closing government. So closing government extension is quite weak. So closing government suggests that we are going to open safe spaces. There are two problems with this. The first problem with this is that it assumes that these safe spaces are inherently good. Presumably, safe spaces are not always good. People perceive living within patriarchal society and women having safe spaces are inherent benefit. Oftentimes, living within safe spaces is considered as living within echo chambers, which ends up harming these people's life more and more. So, what closing government needs to explain is that they living within safe spaces and prioritizing their identity is more important for people living within the worst quality of life. Which means that even if closing government is correct, their extension harms people more. For all those reasons, so proud to win from.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech and all the speakers. Okay, does everyone have their initial calls ready? Or if you want to take a minute, that will be fine.
I'd like to take a minute.
Yeah, cool.
Hi, sorry. I guess while waiting, Chair, do you happen to have the speaker positions? Because we'll need the name for the finals best speaker.
I don't have them like written, but I remember them. Just
All right. Okay.
So I might have them, so I can just.
Oh yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
I'm just putting it in the chat.
Yeah, in the meanwhile, I think we're ready with the initial calls, I hope. Riva, if you have yours, would you mind starting?
Sorry, do I send it or do you want me to say it verbally?
Sorry?
Should I send it to you like through Zoom or do you want me to say it verbally instead?
You can say it verbally. It's fine.
Oh, so I'm gonna give it to CO.
Okay. Shishir, what about you?
I have a long cross. I would like to discuss OGCO.
Okay. And Umu, what about you?
Yeah, I have OG and then CO.
Okay.
I have CO, then OG.
Okay, so we all have a long cross. Mine is also CO and then OG. Uma, I didn't catch yours. Is it CO and OG or OG and CO?
CO, then OG.
All right. So Shishir has CO above OG. Umu has CO above OG. Tejas has OG above CO. Riva, do you have a second? Oh, see. Yeah, if you have a second, then let us know.
Oh yeah, my second's OG.
All right. So I think we can start with Tejas as to why do you have OG above CO?
Sure, yeah. I think for me it's a close one, but I think again it boils down to three things. Um, Three things from OG. The three larger impacts that I get is firstly that the resources are going to be better off. secondly, with respect to interaction, and thirdly, with respect to long-term impacts. I think what OG tries to prove to me through that model is that uh, how do these communities are going to go ahead and build trust, which simply leads to like a better economy in general. Second thing is that how are you simply going to have like concessions, because now you're talking about post-conflict society, you need certain state concessions, which is going to like be good over time. Third thing is that they prove to me that there is a certain like certainty factor there, which is why when we need to simply talk about long term, you have various communities going ahead and interacting with each other, which is why like you have like better autonomy, you're going to have better policies. Very well proven impacts on OG. How do that I compare that to like CO? I think it again boils down to 2 points. Is CO firstly they go ahead and call out interconnectedness that is there. What CEO goes ahead and talks to me about is that firstly, they come and tell me that, sure, you're going to have these communities, but there's going to be a larger leverage gap that is there, which is why when you're specifically talking about crisis, there's going to be a major gap of like resource distribution that is there, which is why communities are going to be locked out. Second argument is that when you talk about they bring out the point about like engagement that is there. The point on like minorities, they come and tell me that you're going to go ahead and like have a crackdown on gov within minorities, which is why you're simply not going to have these policies. That is, they go ahead and call out these policies and stability that is already given like within gov that is there. To the extent that I do not buy it to the fullest extent that how is like the stability and autonomy going to be lost that is there. Sure, I get the extension within CO, but I think OS then still is able to like prove to me like long-term stability and autonomy, the way that the communities interact with each other, and how is like governance done within these post-conflict states that is there. I think although like CO tries to like mitigate this, according to me, I don't think it is as mitigatory to like go ahead and bring down like OG's case for me. I think that's the larger clash between these two benches for me.
Okay, that's fair. Would anyone like to support or like disagree with this on to why CO takes over OG for them? Umo, you can.
Sure.
I have a follow-up question, actually, if that's fine.
Sure.
Yeah.
My follow-up question is, you mentioned briefly at the end that OG is able to prove that in the long term, they're able to have established a good form of internal governance. Can you expound on the mechanism that you found persuasive in that part?
Yeah, governance and policy. I don't think specifically they tell me that you have like a leader or someone that is going to go ahead and govern, but through their case, I think I'm able to get like when you go ahead and people live within like these, you have certain connections, you go ahead and have like concessions for people. When you talk specifically about state capacity that is there, you have people of these various identities that are going to live with each other within these within like a certain harmony, which is why like people are going to be like go ahead and flock together. That is there. That's the only like thing that I get, that because of which you're going to like have stability. That's the mechanism that I credited. I don't think apart from that there's any
All
mechanism.
right, thank you.
Yeah, I think. Would anyone like to add to that, or like,
Can I step into this binary?
yeah, absolutely.
I think the bottom line of what OG says is one, that post-colonial states they need collaboration definitively, which is why resource sharing is important. I think what they do end up proving is that for these communities which are fragmented, for them to live together and share resources is a prerequisite to unlocking any sort of policy change that is achieved in the long term. I think the problem with this is, again, the question on suspicion that Riva just asked, which is where do they end up necessarily proving that the sort of tension that exists between these minority communities and other communities are solved in the long run? All they say is, listen, these communities need to live together for them to trust the state. That's all right. But in the long term, how does the conflict or tension between these communities, these minority communities and other communities get solved is something that OG doesn't answer, which means they don't necessarily have a long-term solution to their own problem. CO on the comparative says that, listen, minority communities in and of itself are not at an equal playing field. They're not equitable, which means there are some communities that dominate, which means that the way that these federal structures are formed might outfavor one community, which means that other weaker communities might be coerced into taking deals out of desperations, which might not be in their best interest. The second thing that they point out or flag towards OG is their deficit in terms of explaining this long-term solvency between two communities that I just spoke of. But I think the debate winning extension at CO, according to me, is them explaining that probably economics matter more than culture in this context because it's just more proximate to people. It's in the interest of people to ensure that they're making money first before they end up actually developing some sort of collective cultural cohesiveness. Because even if they do at OG, I'm not sure how the tension between those communities and other communities gets solved. So I think CO is able to prove that if you don't have such ethnic federations, then at least you have trade, at least people get more money, which is why probably in the long term these tensions get solved. Sure, the extent of solvency to this problem is not very clear, but it's still comparatively better than OG, because I'm not sure how trust to the state automatically solves ethnic tensions that OG identifies as their problem statement.
Yeah, I think they just wants to continue.
Yeah, just one question and then sorry. Then like, maybe one if you can add. On the debate winning extension that you said that economy matters more than culture. I think apart from being like logically prior, uh, it's this debate is specifically about like post-conflict states, and you're simply going to have something like ethnic federalism. So it's like how governance and systems are really going to be like. So I think the long-term impact then is that what OG has already like talked about. I think that's more relevant. Sure, like economics and like people have to be far more better, but I still feel that OG could like better prove to me that people are going to be like united. That is that people are like going to be better. On the harms of like you said that whatever CO talks, I don't think that is like enough to take it over OG. So just that's like a question to like Shishi. Yeah, thanks. That's
Would anyone say, yeah, Riva, you can go.
So I wanna first agree that I believe the strongest piece of material in weighing from OG is when they explain that internal stability, because of the trust, is likely to happen. My question here is, and the reason why I care about more of the long-term comparative given by CO, which is that eventually societies will integrate when they move past the conflict, is I'm just not sure as to why that trust will exist in the long term when opening government. So the mechanism they give, right, is you see someone from the same group as you and you trust them. But that is still kind of dependent on you being able to deliver as a community leader, like better economic outcomes for people. So for me, even if they get internal trust or rather instant trust, I'm just not sure as to why that trust will exist in the long term if it's not clear on OG's model, as what is pointed out by the other panelists, that they get any long-term economic benefit. Because it's not just against CO, right? Like even against OO, I don't think they answer the question of what if the resources are allocated differently? What if, for example, negotiation means that it's tipped in a way that is against these minorities, which is another extension brought by CO to explain as to why they have ultimate leveraging power if you're the majority. So I'm just curious on if we still believe that that is the strongest point in the debate. Number one, does it really exist independent, completely independent from the economics of it? But the second thing is, given that, how do you still weigh it against the long-term positive comparative of CO, which is reintegration, which they still prove leads to all of these same economic and trust outcomes as opening government?
Could I add to that? I think on that only, I feel like on the clash of like OG and CO, what CO primarily does is it brings a sort of urgency metric to the debate, which means that when what I get on CO is that what I get on OG is that at best it's a short term impact of like people having faith in the system or people probably like trusting the government to a certain extent. The issue that I have with that, which is called out at CO, is essentially that this is a post-conflict state, which means that majority of people are probably poor, or majority of people probably don't have access to the right kind of resources. Which means that these people might not care about their identities, or might not care about like a safe space as much right now as they probably care about getting a job to a certain extent, or probably getting opportunities or more land. I think insofar as economy and economic growth was pointed out as the most proximate metric to these people and the most proximate metric for these people to probably grow, I feel like that defeats what OG is trying to push about like short-term stability. And I also agree with Shishir on the fact that short-term stability does not necessarily translate into long-term stability or does not translate into long-term unity within the country, because OG was not able to prove that. And even if that unity does not exist, OG can't really prove to me why that will still be like a good thing, or why the country will essentially still be like a functioning society where people get sustained. Yeah, Omar, you can go.
I agree. And even with the short-term stability in the best case scenario of OG, where maybe the people don't care most about their economic state or whatever, I think C already proved how already, due to the fact that there would be some disproportional distribution of resources and all of that would even fuel more conflict. So if there's disproportional development of the different federal states, then there is an exacerbation of the problem. So beyond the fact that maybe this particular ethnic group killed your grandmother or whatever, right now you're looking at them and you're thinking they are developing at a faster pace as compared to you. So that creates even more entrenched reasons why there would be conflicts in perpetuity. So I felt that even in terms of responses to the best case scenario from side opening government, that they're doing it for the short-term benefit, which I do not think is sufficiently proved. And I agree with you that people do not really care about other stuff at that particular moment because they've lost a lot of land and they've lost a lot of resources. The best case scenario whereby even if they do care about that, I think the fact that the distribution would be disproportional means then that the conflict would then be exacerbated. So I think on that front, CO was winning on that particular conversation for me.
I feel like that's a fair call. Does anyone have anything else to add on the CO versus OG contention?
Yeah, I'm willing to flip. I agree to like what Riva said, that you have something that is completely independent of economics and long-term reintegration. I think how I weighed like OG is how I like initially had OG is that just based on this urgency metric, and it's what I weighed, that how does it happen within the short term. I think on long-term economics, CO still takes it better because as OG doesn't like really give that mech. So yeah, I think I'll flip on that. Works.
Okay, cool, perfect. So I think we have a unanimous call then. CO wins the debate, OG is the runner-up. I think we should decide the finals best speaker now. On CO, do you have any preferences? We can
I had
start
a
with
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, you can go.
Personally, I have a preference for the whip.
Cool. Pages you can go.
Yeah, I also had preference for Aryan.
Okay. Eva, you can go.
I had a preference for the whip as well.
Shishir, you can go.
Yeah, preference for Aryan. Whip.
All right, it's a unanimous whip best speaker. Perfect. I think that ends everything. If there is there anything else that anyone needs to discuss?
I think there's just one minor bit that I would like to add.
Yeah.
In terms of the extent of proving what matters to these people more, I think the analysis on both OG and CO is pretty parallel, because OG says, listen, these people are very hostile towards other communities, which is why trust matters to them more. And CO says they're poor, which is why money matters to them more than trust per se. I think none of these reasons counteract the other in terms of explaining why either of them takes logical priority over the other. But the way I think this deadlock is cleanly resolved goes down to CO's characterization in terms of saying that the way that you implement these ethnic federations would not be equitable, which means not all ethnic minorities, which seem to be the most important for OG, would be served in an equal capacity, which goes down to their analysis on how majority communities would dominate and would coerce desperate communities into making choices that are bad for them. Which is why, on that note, in terms of the implementation of these federations being uncharitable, probably in that context, an economic benefit is just more certain. and gives you better long-term solvency to the issues of conflicts. I would just like to make that clear. I don't think automatically saying that money matters more than identity without substantial explanation of why that is the case automatically goes to CEO's favor. It's just what I
Yeah,
think.
I agree with you, and I also think that outright weighing of that comes at with where we talk about how economics is more important because once you can probably assure yourself a better quality of life, you can now probably get a better identity, or you can probably feel better in your identity. I think this is at least implicitly present on their web, which is a weighing that I particularly buy, which is why economics just becomes one of the most important metrics in this debate.
Yep, that's fair.
Yeah, I'm just curious, like, what would be the speaker margin in case like we had to? Is it like a 80-81 for CEO?
Yeah, I think so. It's an equal one for me.
Hi, sorry. We can continue talking, but I just want to make sure. I'm gonna message Cap and OC about the decision already, just so they can start making the slides.
Yeah, absolutely.